I was standing in my kitchen when the notification buzzed. At first, I didn't think much of it. My mother rarely texted me directly. Usually, it was a forwarded recipe, a reminder about someone's birthday, or a message sent through my brother. But this time, her name glowed alone on my screen. I opened it, expecting something small, maybe a family update. Instead, there it was, a single paragraph that would rearrange the shape of my world forever. "We've agreed you're no longer part of the family. Don't come to any gatherings." I read it once, then again. The words didn't move, didn't explain, didn't soften. They just sat there, cold and final like a tombstone. My first reaction wasn't even anger. It was disbelief. My mother's voice played in my head, firm, familiar, always a little disappointed. But this message wasn't disappointment. It was exile. I stood frozen, my coffee cooling beside me, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. My chest felt tight, and I waited for some follow-up, some clarification, maybe even a cruel joke. Nothing came, just the silence that always followed when she'd said enough. I sank into the nearest chair, staring at the text. It felt like an ending I hadn't realized was coming, though maybe I should have. The signs had been there. Whispered comments, the way she looked past me at family dinners, the constant comparisons to my brother. He was the achiever, the pride, the one who made the family proud. I was the helper, the one who showed up early, stayed late, and somehow still didn't belong. Even as a kid, I'd felt it. The way my drawings were overlooked while his soccer trophies got framed photos. My mother used to say I was too emotional, as if feeling things deeply were a flaw that needed correcting. As I scrolled back through old messages, I noticed how few there really were. Months of silence, broken by occasional logistical texts. Be there by 6. Bring dessert. Never warmth. Never love. It wasn't until now that I realized how transactional our relationship had become. The words on my screen weren't born in a moment of rage. They were the result of years of quiet rejection. Tears came, slow and disbelieving. I wanted to call her, to ask why, to defend myself against something I didn't understand. But a strange instinct stopped me. I knew how it would go. She'd sigh, maybe even cry, and then somehow make me feel like I was the one who caused the fracture. That was her gift, turning my confusion into guilt. So I didn't call. I just sat there, letting the realization wash over me that I was, apparently, family-less. My mind ran through possibilities. Did I miss an event? Say something wrong at the last gathering? I thought of Thanksgiving, when I brought a store-bought pie because I'd worked late. My mother had smiled thinly, whispering to my aunt. She doesn't even try anymore. Or Christmas, when I gave her a framed picture of us from years ago and she'd said, "You could have at least picked a better one." Maybe this message had been years in the making, written between those small cuts. I reread it again, almost hoping the words would change. "We've agreed." That part stung the most. Who was we? My father? My brother? My aunt? The idea that they had discussed me, decided on me, like I was an unpleasant topic at a meeting, shattered something deep inside. I imagined them at a dinner table, talking casually about my removal, maybe even nodding in agreement. It felt like being voted out of my own bloodline. The clock ticked past midnight before I realized how long I'd been sitting there. The message stayed open on my phone, glowing in the dark room like a cruel nightlight. I typed a dozen responses. Why? Please explain. What did I do? But deleted them all. There was no version of myself that could beg again. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Instead, I put the phone down and stared at the wall. The house felt emptier than usual, as if their rejection had physically removed something from the air. I thought about calling a friend, but shame held me back. How do you tell someone your own mother disowned you? It sounded pathetic even to me, so I swallowed it. The same way I'd swallowed every unkind remark, every eye roll, every dismissal. Somewhere between exhaustion and heartbreak, I began to remember little moments. My mother brushing past me to hug my brother, her voice bright with pride when she spoke of him, her silence when she spoke of me. It had always been there, just quieter. Now it had simply found words. When I finally crawled into bed, I left the lights on. I couldn't stand the thought of waking in darkness, alone with that message. I kept the phone face down on the nightstand, but I could still feel its weight pressing against the room. I knew I wouldn't sleep. I just lay there, replaying every scene from the past 30 years, searching for the moment I became disposable. Morning came, and the message was still there. Unread by me, but forever read by my heart. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say, but a small bitter thought formed beneath the ache. If they could erase me so easily, maybe they'd already lost me long before this message ever arrived. I used to believe that families didn't just stop loving you, that blood carried a kind of permanent loyalty. But as I sat staring at my mother's message, that belief began to feel like a fairy tale I'd outgrown. Maybe it hadn't started last night. Maybe it started years ago, in 1,000 small moments that I mistook for normal. I was the quiet one, the one who blended into corners while my brother filled every room with light. He was the golden child, the pride of my parents' stories. My mother's face would soften when she spoke his name, as though she were describing an accomplishment rather than a person. "He's always been gifted," she'd say, and people would nod, impressed. When she spoke about me, her tone would shift, polite, detached. "She's doing fine," she'd offer, as if fine were something to aspire to. Our childhood home was a 2-story brick house with tidy curtains and unspoken rules. My mother liked things quiet, predictable, and preferably her way. My father was there but not present, the kind of man who hid behind newspapers in silence. If my brother forgot to mow the lawn, my mother would sigh and do it herself, muttering about boys being boys. But if I forgot to take out the trash, it became a lecture about responsibility, about how girls should know better. I learned early that fairness didn't live in our house. Only hierarchy did. When I was 10, I won a district art competition. I remember running home, the paper ribbon clutched in my hand, ready to see pride in her eyes. She didn't even look up from the stove. "That's nice," she said, stirring soup, her voice flat. "Now set the table." That night at dinner, she told my father about how my brother had been picked for the soccer team again. My little victory vanished somewhere between the salt shaker and her next breath. I spent my teenage years chasing her approval like a mirage. Good grades, clean rooms, quiet obedience. None of it earned me warmth. When I tried to talk to her, she'd deflect with sarcasm. "You're too sensitive," she'd say, as though my feelings were an inconvenience she had to manage. My father's eyes would dart to his plate, silent witness to a crime he'd never name. My brother and I were close once, or maybe I imagined we were. When we were kids, he'd sneak me extra cookies from the jar, or let me tag along when he played outside. But as we grew, he began to echo her tone, her distance. He'd tease me in front of her and she'd laugh. That laugh hurt more than any insult. It was approval disguised as cruelty. I remember one birthday as my 16th. She forgot. Not because she was busy, but because she simply didn't think of it. I reminded her that morning, half joking, expecting her to feign surprise. Instead, she frowned and said, "You don't need to make a big deal out of everything." She didn't bake a cake, didn't even say the words. That night, my brother took the car out with his friends, and I ate dinner alone. The next day, she acted as though nothing had happened. Maybe to her, nothing had. As I got older, the indifference became sharper, more deliberate. When I got my first job, she said, "Well, at least you're managing." When I moved into my first apartment, she complained I was too far away to help out anymore. And when I left an unhealthy relationship, she asked, "What did you do to make him leave?" Each time I felt smaller, like my existence required justification. Our family gatherings were rehearsed performances. She'd serve food, smile for photos, and then quietly exclude me from conversations. I became the listener, the invisible audience to their laughter. My brother would brag about promotions, vacations, and my mother would beam. I'd bring a dish, try to engage, but my words would float unnoticed. If I spoke about something good in my life, she'd find the flaw. "Oh, so you're still working there. That's cute. When are you going to settle down?" And my father, he never defended me. He'd sit there, passive and tired, sipping his tea like neutrality could protect him. But his silence felt like agreement. I stopped expecting him to intervene when I realized he never would. Looking back, I think my mother needed someone to blame for her disappointments. My father was too distant, my brother too adored, so I became the sponge that absorbed everything she didn't want to face. If she and my father fought, it was because I was too dramatic. If my brother acted out, it was because I set a bad example. I became the family scapegoat, the embodiment of everything imperfect. Now, reading her text again, I see it for what it really was. Not a sudden decision, but a final confirmation of a role she'd been casting me in my whole life. I was never the daughter she wanted. I was the reminder of something she couldn't control, someone who refused to break quietly. And so, when she wrote, "We've agreed you're no longer part of the family," it wasn't an impulsive act. It was the inevitable conclusion of a story that had been unfolding for decades. The story of a daughter who kept trying to belong in a family that had already decided she didn't. The invitation came in the mail. A formal card with fancy calligraphy announcing my cousin's engagement party. I almost didn't go, but something inside me whispered that attendance was necessary, that showing my face might remind them I still existed. I dressed carefully, choosing something understated but elegant, hoping my presence could blend without drawing scorn. I told myself it would be fine. A night of polite conversation, a few forced smiles, and then I could leave. But from the moment I stepped through the door, the weight of their judgment pressed down on me. My mother was there, of course, radiant in a silk dress, flanked by my brother who practically glowed with self-satisfaction. The moment I entered, her gaze slid over me, dismissive and cold. "Oh, you made it," she said, her voice holding just enough sweetness to sting. "Still working at that little job, I see." Laughter followed from a few relatives, the kind that's polite in tone but sharp in intention. I forced a smile, but it felt brittle, like paper ready to tear. The evening dragged on, each passing minute layered with microaggressions I had grown accustomed to, but never accepted. My brother recounted the details of his recent promotion, the corner office, the bonuses, the accolades, with my mother nodding enthusiastically at every word. I tried to participate, offering quiet updates about my own work, but her eyes would flicker away, just as they always did, and a cousin would quickly change the topic. It wasn't the words themselves that cut the deepest. It was the blatant absence of recognition, the way I existed as a shadow while my brother basked in light. The breaking point came during dinner. My mother, clearing a dish, leaned over and whispered loud enough for a nearby aunt to hear. "I never thought she'd make it this far," still struggling as usual. A hush passed, and a few polite nods followed, as if acknowledging that this was indeed her place, always behind, always inadequate. My chest tightened, a mix of humiliation and disbelief washing over me. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, the sting of tears I fought to hold back. I excused myself, murmuring a casual lie about needing fresh air. But instead of relief, the cool night air brought no comfort. Each breath felt heavy, each step away from the house echoing with the memory of her words. I sank onto the front steps, head in my hands, and let myself shiver in silence. The world felt absurdly loud, full of laughter and clinking glasses inside, while I sat as an outsider, both physically and emotionally expelled. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The humiliation clung to me, an invisible weight pressing into my chest. I grabbed my phone and typed a message I would later regret sending, or perhaps not. "Mom, what did I do wrong? Why do you treat me like I don't belong?" I stared at the words, rereading them, heart pounding, fingers hovering over send. Then with a shaky breath, I hit send. Minutes passed. Then an hour. No reply. Silence. My mother had not responded, had not offered an explanation, an apology, or even a single acknowledgement. I stared at the blank screen, the quiet emptiness louder than any insult. It was then that I realized that her cruelty was not in spur-of-the-moment words, but in consistent, deliberate neglect, the kind that didn't need a justification. I curled up on my bed, exhausted from the public humiliation and the private heartbreak, wondering if I would ever belong in the family that had already written me out. It was mid-afternoon when my phone buzzed again. I'd almost convinced myself that the humiliation from the gathering was an isolated incident. that maybe my mother had a moment of thoughtlessness and it would all pass. But this notification shattered any fragile hope I had left. I opened it, hands trembling, and my heart seemed to stop mid-beat. The words scrawled across the screen were simple, precise, and devastating. "We've agreed you're no longer part of the family. Don't come to any gatherings." Reading it felt like a death without a funeral. There was no warning, no argument, no chance for reconciliation, just finality. I sank into the couch, clutching the phone like a lifeline that had already been cut. My mind raced, flashing back to every overlooked birthday, every unnoticed achievement, every time I had been compared to my brother and found wanting. Each memory now felt like evidence in a trial I hadn't known I was standing in. I scrolled through old texts, searching for a misstep, something I could blame myself for. But all I found were polite, dutiful messages on my part, a daughter trying, always trying, to belong. Friends' comments on social media posts and group messages I'd once thought harmless now stung with clarity. Everyone had known, everyone had seen it coming, and none of them had spoken up. Even those I considered allies had remained silent, reinforcing the invisible wall that had been built around me. The loneliness crept in like ice, settling into every bone. I felt stranded, a ghost within the family I had tried so hard to be part of. I kept rereading the text, as if repetition could somehow make it less true, as if staring long enough at the words might convince them to vanish. But they didn't. They remained, stark and immovable, and in their permanence, I understood the depth of the betrayal. By evening, the weight of it all pressed down so heavily that I could barely think. Every memory, every small slight, every laugh at my expense came flooding back with renewed sharpness. The house felt suffocatingly empty, even though I was alone. Their message wasn't just a line of text. It was a declaration that I had been erased from their lives, and the world I had known had shifted irreversibly. I sat there in silence, gripping the phone, letting the ache of abandonment wash over me, knowing that the chapter I had tried to live within my family had definitively closed. I didn't respond to her message. Not that night, not the next, not ever. The urge to explain myself, to plead for inclusion, rose like a tide, and then receded every time I remembered her consistent indifference. Begging would accomplish nothing, and I had learned that the hard way. So instead, I chose silence. I packed what I could carry into a battered suitcase, leaving behind the house that had never felt like mine, and the city that had echoed with her disapproval for decades. Moving to a new city felt like stepping into a blank page. I rented a small apartment with paint peeling at the corners and a view of a busy street that never slept. There was no family, no reminders of past failures, no comparisons to my brother. The silence of the place was comforting and terrifying all at once. I spent the first few nights sitting on the floor, surrounded by unpacked boxes, letting grief roll over me. But grief, I realized, could be a tool as well as a burden. I began writing notes to myself, small reminders of strength, fragments of self-help books, quotes I had underlined years ago. You are enough. Your worth is not measured by their recognition. Independence is the ultimate revenge. I stuck these scraps on my fridge, taped them to mirrors, carried them in my wallet. Every time doubt crept in, I read them aloud, letting the words shape my resolve. I worked long hours at a cafe, then a bookstore, then tutoring in the evenings. Every job was a small step, every paycheck a brick in the wall I was building between myself and the family who had abandoned me. Exhaustion became familiar, almost comforting because it was earned. No one could take it from me. I began to see the value in my own efforts, the pride in labor done for myself, the satisfaction of progress measured by personal milestones rather than external approval. Some nights, I allowed myself to remember the rejection, the public humiliation, the message that had ended everything. But instead of despair, a quiet determination rose. I would never again place my happiness in the hands of people who had consistently failed to see me. I would not wait for approval, affection, or acknowledgement that might never come. With each passing week, I felt my old self, the insecure, overlooked girl, slipping further into the shadows of memory. In her place, someone new was emerging, someone cautious but unyielding, hurt but unwilling to bend. someone who had learned that silence could be sharper than any argument, stronger than any plea. That silence became my weapon, a shield against their cruelty and a foundation for the life I was determined to build on my own terms. It was at a local coffee shop, one I had taken to spending afternoons in while scribbling ideas in a worn notebook, that I first met her. She noticed the sketches I'd been quietly drawing, leaning over the table with an ease that made intrusion feel like kindness. "These are good," she said, her voice steady, deliberate. I froze, unsure if she was being polite or dismissive, but her eyes stayed on mine, unwavering. It was the first time someone outside my fractured family had truly looked at me, not with judgment or comparison, but with recognition. Her name was Elena, and she was a small business consultant with a keen eye for design. She asked questions not to pry but to understand. She listened as I explained my work, my dreams, and the hesitancy I carried like armor. Every nod, every smile, every thoughtful pause conveyed belief in a way my mother never had. For the first time in decades, I felt seen, truly seen, and it ignited something I had thought long extinguished. Over the following weeks, we met regularly. Elena taught me the fundamentals of running a business, from budgeting to client management, but she also taught me how to trust my instincts. She challenged me gently, pointing out where I undervalued myself and helping me reframe failures as lessons. Each session chipped away at the internalized voice that had whispered, for years, that I wasn't enough. With her guidance, I began to sketch a business plan for a small design studio, one I could manage independently. She helped me find affordable suppliers, suggested marketing strategies, and encouraged me to enter my work in local exhibitions. Her confidence in me felt contagious. I started to see possibilities instead of walls, opportunities instead of rejection. The contrast between her warmth and my family's cold indifference could not have been sharper. While my mother had dismissed every accomplishment, Elena celebrated the smallest victories, pointing out what I had achieved on my own. I began to feel that quiet, simmering pride, the kind that doesn't need validation from those who would never give it. By the time I left that coffee shop after one particularly productive afternoon, I realized I had begun to reclaim a part of myself that had been lost for years. The spark of potential, nurtured by someone who truly believed in me, was igniting a path I had never dared to imagine, a path away from the shadow of my family and toward a life I could finally call my own. Years passed quietly, almost imperceptibly at first and then all at once. The small design studio I had started with Elena's guidance grew steadily, each project a testament to my skill, resilience, and determination. I became known in the local community not as the overlooked daughter of a cold family, but as a professional whose work spoke for itself. Recognition arrived in the form of repeat clients, whispered recommendations, and small awards I never flaunted, preferring the satisfaction of accomplishment over external applause. My days were long, filled with sketches, meetings, and client calls, but for the first time, they felt mine. Elena retired after several years, passing partial ownership of the business to me with a quiet confidence that made my chest swell. "You've earned this," she said, as if the years of hard work I had poured into the studio were finally acknowledged by someone who understood its value. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders, but it was a weight I welcomed, a sign that I had finally claimed authority over my own life. I moved into a modest home, a small but comfortable space that symbolized independence in its simplest form. Each corner, each wall, reflected choices I had made, free from judgment or expectation. I painted it with colors I loved, filled it with objects that reminded me of my own triumphs, rather than the failures they had tried to define. The house became a sanctuary, a physical manifestation of the distance I had carved between my past and my present. Despite my growing success, I avoided social media. I feared discovery, the sudden intrusion of the family who had once dismissed me entirely. It wasn't pride or secrecy that guided me. It was self-preservation. I wanted to build my life on my terms, without interference, without the risk of their jealousy or misguided attempts at reconciliation. The transformation was subtle to outsiders, but profound to me. I went from the invisible daughter, constantly overlooked and dismissed, to a woman whose quiet achievements spoke louder than any family approval ever could. I felt a calm satisfaction in my daily routines, in the independence I had forged, and in the knowledge that I no longer needed anyone's validation to measure my worth. In the shadows of my past, I had found light, a self-made success born not from their acknowledgement but from my own relentless effort. Every phone call I ignored, every invitation I declined, every late night spent perfecting a project instead of pleading for attention had been steps toward this life. The invisible child had grown into someone formidable, someone who had learned that silence could nurture power just as effectively as words or confrontation. And though I still carried the memory of their neglect, it no longer haunted me. It had been transformed into motivation, into the quiet, steady fuel that propelled me forward. I had been reborn in the shadows they had cast, and for the first time, I existed entirely on my own terms, independent, respected, and untouchable by the family that had once tried to erase me. It was an ordinary Tuesday when the email arrived, buried in my inbox among bills and client inquiries. At first I thought it was spam or a misdirected message, but then I saw the subject line, "Family Wedding, RSVP needed." My heart sank before I even opened it. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the trackpad, dreading what I was about to read. When I finally clicked, the group message revealed itself. My mother had forwarded the chain with a note attached. "Don't include her," it read. "She'll ruin the pictures." I stared at the screen, frozen, as a strange calm overtook the familiar sting. For a moment, memories of past rejections, overlooked birthdays, and family gatherings where I had felt invisible flickered through my mind. The old wounds opened for a split second, but this time, tears didn't follow. I felt nothing but quiet amusement at the absurdity of it. The very family that had cast me out was still trying to dictate the terms of my participation in their lives. I glanced at my calendar, noting the irony. The same week as this wedding, I had a client meeting scheduled to close the biggest deal my business had seen yet. A deal that would cement my independence and mark years of silent work finally paying off. I realized, with a sharp, private satisfaction, that I would be where I needed to be, in the exact moment that mattered for me, not for them. The sting of exclusion had lost its power. I understood, finally, that their attempts to control or embarrass me were irrelevant. I had grown beyond the reach of their judgments. My life no longer revolved around their approval or attention. The email became less a source of pain and more a reminder of the distance I had traveled. For the first time, I felt a sense of triumph simmering quietly beneath the surface. I had learned to laugh at their ignorance, to recognize the futility in their attempts to diminish me. That email, meant to wound, only confirmed that I was no longer bound by their opinions. I could choose my own priorities, my own gatherings, my own victories, and they would be powerless to touch them. I had built my life quietly, deliberately, never flaunting my success, but letting it grow steadily, like a seed planted in fertile soil. I kept meticulous records, nurtured my clients, and reinvested every profit into expansion. Then whispers started to reach me. Not from my family, of course, but through industry contacts and mutual clients. Their family business, once a source of pride and status, was unraveling. Lawsuits, debt, and mismanagement were piling up, and my brother, once untouchable, was scrambling to keep the empire from collapsing. It was a strange sensation, hearing these updates. Part of me felt a flicker of vindication, a quiet satisfaction that life had a way of balancing scales, even when people refused to see your worth. But mostly, I remained focused on my own trajectory. I wasn't gloating. I was planning, strategically, waiting for the right moment to act in ways that aligned with my principles and my ambition. My company had grown enough to consider acquisitions. One evening, I reviewed a portfolio of potential opportunities and realized that one firm under consideration was intimately linked to my family's business network. It wasn't intentional at first, purely coincidental, a result of smart targeting and diligent research. But as I examined the contracts and projected revenue, the irony hit me. My hard work was positioning me to quietly intersect with the very network that had once dismissed me, excluded me, and tried to erase me. I stayed calm, as I always had, taking meticulous notes, projecting revenue and calculating risks. I imagined the contrast, my small but thriving studio, once overlooked, now growing into a company with reach that touched the edges of their influence. The thought of reclaiming power in this manner without confrontation, was intoxicating. Every late night, every missed social event, every sacrifice I had endured suddenly became the foundation for this moment of subtle reversal. The news of their financial troubles filtered in more consistently over the next weeks. My brother was juggling lawyers and unpaid bills. My parents, who had once dictated the family's social and business standing, were forced into reactive decisions, scrambling to manage crises they had ignored until it was too late. Meanwhile, I was making calculated, confident moves, each acquisition a quiet assertion of my competence and independence. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. The universe had created a scenario in which my perseverance and skill were positioning me in stark contrast to their failures. I was no longer invisible, no longer the overlooked daughter. I was a force operating quietly, with precision, and entirely on my own terms. As I finalized the paperwork for the acquisition linked to their network, I allowed myself a private moment of acknowledgement. I had arrived here not through scheming or malice, but through resilience, intelligence, and relentless determination. The scales were shifting, subtly but unmistakably. The reversal wasn't loud or theatrical yet, but it was inevitable, and I would be ready when the moment arrived. The email arrived unexpectedly, coming from a business consultant my family had hired. My mother had reached out to secure an investor for a struggling venture, completely unaware that the person on the other end of the line was me. At first, I stared at the message in disbelief. My name was carefully hidden in the header, my identity masked, but the desperation in her words was unmistakable. I almost laughed at the irony. The very family who had disowned me was now pleading for assistance from the daughter they had spent decades overlooking. I agreed to a meeting, carefully crafting an identity that allowed me to operate without revealing who I truly was. I wanted them to be seen as equals, to feel their own desperation without the buffer of familiarity. There was a thrill in the knowledge that I could listen, observe, and evaluate them without fear of bias or emotional entanglement. The power dynamic had shifted in subtle but delicious ways. For once, they were the supplicants, and I held the leverage. The day of the meeting arrived. I sat in a conference room under the pretense of a potential investor, taking meticulous notes, asking probing questions, and maintaining an air of professional detachment. Their anxiety was palpable. My mother, usually so composed and controlled, fidgeted with her papers, her eyes darting nervously between me and the consultant she assumed was my assistant. My brother tried to assert dominance, but his usual confidence faltered under the scrutiny of someone who truly understood business and understood him. They presented their pitch with forced enthusiasm, detailing struggles that were the result of years of mismanagement, poor decisions, and oversights. I nodded, offering neutral commentary, probing deeper only when necessary. I could see the frustration build as my questions revealed gaps in their plan they hadn't considered, weaknesses they hadn't anticipated. The desperation in their gestures, the tremor in their voices, was something I had never seen from them before. It was a stark contrast to the cold indifference they had shown me for years. Throughout the meeting, I remained silent about my true identity. Part of me relished the irony, the exquisite poetic justice of watching them struggle without knowing who held the keys to their solution. My mind replayed decades of neglect, humiliation, and dismissals, each memory fueling the quiet satisfaction simmering beneath my professional demeanor. This was not revenge for the sake of cruelty, but a demonstration of the strength I had built from their rejection. By the end of the meeting, they were pleading for advice, for direction, for support. I offered measured recommendations, carefully balancing guidance with restraint, ensuring they would feel both relief and dependence without realizing who had saved them. As they left the room, exhausted and anxious, I allowed myself a private smile. For the first time, I realized the full extent of the reversal. They needed help, and yet they didn't know that the person capable of giving it was the very daughter they had abandoned. The balance of power had shifted completely, and I was in control, hidden in plain sight, orchestrating their salvation, while they remained oblivious to the source. The thrill of this quiet dominance coursed through me, a long-awaited vindication earned through patience, skill, and relentless determination. The day of the final meeting arrived, and I walked into the boardroom like someone who owned every inch of her confidence. I was calm, composed, dressed in tailored elegance that spoke of both success and quiet authority. Every step I took resonated with the weight of years I had spent building myself from the fragments they had discarded. My mother and brother were already there, shuffling papers and exchanging nervous glances, completely unaware that the woman entering the room was the very daughter they had cast out. As I approached the table, my mother froze mid-sentence, her words catching in her throat. The warmth in her usual smile vanished, replaced by something that teetered between disbelief and fear. My brother's voice faltered, a stammer betraying his attempt to appear in control. I let them fumble for a moment, letting the silence stretch, allowing the tension to settle in the space between us. For years I had felt the sharp sting of exclusion. Now their quiet unease mirrored the way I had felt every family gathering, every birthday, every holiday where I had been invisible. I set my briefcase on the table, opened it with deliberate calm, and spread out the contracts and proposals I had prepared. My presence, quiet yet commanding, shifted the room's energy. Suddenly, I was not the child they had dismissed. I was the decision-maker, the person with the authority to influence outcomes that mattered to them, and the irony was exquisite. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her papers, a subtle acknowledgement of the reversal of roles. My brother tried to speak, to assert some semblance of dominance, but I met his gaze steadily, and the words faltered in his throat. He realized, perhaps too late, that the power dynamic had shifted entirely. I was no longer seeking validation or inclusion. I was holding the pen that could determine their future. Every proposal I had prepared, every calculated suggestion, was a testament to the resilience and skill they had once ignored. They tried to negotiate, to regain control, but every argument they made was met with calm, precise, and informed responses. I could see the desperation creeping in, subtle at first, then undeniable. The room, which once might have held laughter at my expense, now resonated with their awareness of my authority. For the first time, I did not shrink, did not hesitate, and did not defer. By the end of the meeting, the shift was undeniable. My mother and brother were silent, weighed down by the realization that the very woman they had erased was now the architect of their business salvation. I remained poised, offering solutions, guiding the process, yet never revealing the full depth of my personal satisfaction. The quiet power I held mirrored the years of exclusion I had endured, now returned to them in perfect symmetry. As the meeting concluded, they left the room with a mix of relief and incredulity, and I sat back, letting the weight of the moment settle over me. I had arrived, not with anger or revenge, but with a presence that could not be ignored, a competence they had once doubted, and an authority they had never expected. For the first time in decades, I felt the full measure of vindication, quiet, composed, and absolute. I listened as my mother and brother nervously outlined their situation, their voices tight with anxiety, their words a mixture of desperation and pleading. They spoke quickly, hoping to convince me with charm, flattery, and half-hearted apologies. I nodded politely, letting them spill everything they had kept hidden, allowing the tension in the room to grow. I didn't interrupt, didn't react emotionally. I let the silence between their sentences speak for me, letting them fill the gaps with their own unease. When they finished, I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table, and spoke clearly. I would help, but only under professional conditions. No family favors, no exceptions, no hidden agendas. Every word was deliberate, steady, and devoid of emotional fluctuation. I outlined the terms, contracts, accountability, and structured repayment plans. I emphasized that my involvement was based solely on merit and necessity, not on familial ties or emotional obligation. My mother tried to interject, voice trembling, attempting to apologize for years of neglect and cruelty. I held up a hand, calm and unyielding. "You already told me who I was to you," I said softly, but with absolute authority. "I just believed you." Her apology faltered, suspended in mid-air, because the truth of my words landed heavier than any confrontation could. My calm dominance was undeniable, unshakable, and it carried more weight than any shouting match ever could. I watched as my brother opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing that charm and entitlement held no power here. The roles had reversed completely. I was no longer the overlooked daughter, begging for acceptance. I was the one controlling the terms, guiding the outcome, and establishing boundaries that had been ignored for decades. By the end of the discussion, the shift was absolute. They were forced to acknowledge the authority I held, not through anger or vindictiveness, but through quiet, unwavering competence and clarity. The emotional climax was not a moment of dramatic confrontation, but a demonstration of restraint, intelligence, and unshakable self-respect. When they left, subdued and chastened, I allowed myself a small private smile. The satisfaction was deep and enduring. I had reclaimed my power, demanded the respect I had been denied for years, and delivered justice not through spectacle, but through calm, measured control. For the first time, I felt fully untouchable, fully validated, and fully myself. It started subtly. A few mentions in local business newsletters and industry blogs. Then, social media picked it up. A post highlighting the woman who had quietly turned a failing family enterprise around. Comments poured in. Admiration, awe, and disbelief that someone so overlooked could possess such skill and tenacity. The news spread faster than I anticipated, moving through professional circles, community groups, and eventually reaching people I hadn't spoken to in years. The recognition felt strange at first, almost surreal, but deeply satisfying. My name was everywhere, attached to achievements they had once assumed I was incapable of. People congratulated me for turning a crisis into an opportunity, for negotiating deals that required intelligence, patience, and foresight. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very family that had dismissed me, excluded me, and erased me was now associated with my success, though they had no claim to it. Their embarrassment, though unspoken publicly, was palpable in private circles, conveyed in awkward glances and whispered apologies from acquaintances who had always known the truth. Local business events and community gatherings began to buzz with recognition of my work. Invitations arrived not from family, but from peers who respected competence and accomplishment. I was no longer invisible. I walked into these rooms with quiet pride, feeling the weight of years of exclusion lift slightly with each nod of acknowledgement. People spoke of me in ways that once belonged exclusively to my brother or mother, and the satisfaction was as subtle as it was profound. At family gatherings, though they tried to maintain composure, I could see the strain. My mother's smiles seemed forced, my brother's casual boasts now hollow in comparison to public acknowledgement of my achievements. Gossip and recognition had created a mirror reflecting their past neglect back at them, and they had no choice but to witness the impact of the woman they had tried to erase. The poetic justice was undeniable. The world had discovered what they refused to see for decades: my competence, resilience, and worth. I felt neither gloating nor malice, only a calm, firm satisfaction that the universe had corrected the imbalance. The once ignored daughter had not only survived, but thrived, and the visibility of her success amplified the consequences of past neglect in a way that words alone could never achieve. Through the whispers, the posts, and the professional accolades, I realized something profound. Validation had finally arrived, not from family, but from a world that recognized what they had refused to. My past invisibility had transformed into present power, and their shame, once hidden, now existed for all to see. A silent echo of the choices they had made. I keep a single family photo tucked away in a drawer. It's worn at the edges, faded from years of handling, yet I cannot bring myself to discard it. I open the drawer sometimes, not to dwell on pain, but to remind myself of how far I've come. The faces staring back, my mother, my brother, the extended family, are frozen in a moment I once longed to belong to. Now I see it differently. That photo is a testament, not to exclusion, but to the power I've cultivated in spite of it. I don't attend family gatherings anymore, and it isn't because I'm uninvited. I've chosen not to. The thought of walking into a room where my worth was once measured by comparison or judgment holds no appeal. I've created spaces where my value is recognized, where my presence commands respect, and where my voice matters. The gatherings I once craved now feel small, inconsequential, and entirely optional. As I prepare for a client meeting, reviewing designs and contracts that are entirely mine, I feel a sense of peace that decades of longing never brought. My successes are my own. The life I've built, brick by brick, is a reflection of persistence, intelligence, and integrity. Every challenge I faced, every slight I endured, has become a building block in a structure that I control fully. I glance at the photo again, tracing the edges with my fingers. Memories flood back, but they no longer sting. Instead, they illuminate the contrast between who I was and who I am now. I see the invisible daughter who once ached for approval, and I see the woman who has transformed grief into achievement, rejection into resilience, and neglect into independence. The shift is complete, and I own it. Life has taught me a profound lesson. I didn't need their seat at the table. I didn't need their approval or their acknowledgement. I built my own table, one that I set according to my values, my vision, and my worth. It is expansive, welcoming, and unshakable. No one can erase me here. No one can diminish the life I have painstakingly constructed. Closing the drawer, I smile quietly, the image of that family frozen in time now serving as a mirror of my triumph rather than my pain. They erased me from the family. Fine. I believed in myself when they refused to, worked when they laughed, persevered when they ignored me, and in the end I built my own. I built my own table, my own space, and my own life, one that no one can take away. The freedom, dignity, and power I hold now are mine entirely, and that more than any inheritance, more than any fleeting acknowledgement, is victory enough.